It's a privilege to be here among all the brilliant psychologists and neuroscientists as you are, and doing so much fascinating work, stimulating discussion. I'm very happy to be here as a philosopher, and I do hope that my discussion, which will not be based on any empirical evidence, but will be at a very theoretical level, will be of some use to your research. And I have tried my best to concentrate on those aspects of my own research in philosophy on curiosity that relates especially to child development and curiosity in children. Let me first say the following. When CF first invited me to the conference, to the presentation, she asked me to present something about the philosophical perspective, what philosophers think of curiosity, and that I really have no answer to, because there is certainly no consensus or a unanimous agreement about what curiosity is among philosophers. Secondly, I'll do now a little give you a historical background. The study of curiosity in philosophy is very recent, extremely recent. It started after psychology. I mean, at least in the 50s, you have Daniel Berline, who was perhaps the founder of the field in the psychology literature, and then we have Levenstein. Both of those figures I would like to, in fact, mention now, and in fact, quote some passages from their works. But when I first opened a class on curiosity, it was, I think, 2005. It was a graduate seminar, and I had difficulty putting a syllabus together because there was so little philosophical text on the topic. There was not a single published book on curiosity in the entire history of philosophy in any language. There was only one chapter that had the title of Curiosity, which was by the great Scottish philosopher David Hume in his famous treatise, a chapter called Curiosity or the Love of Truth, which I made use of. And there were several articles published in the 1990s, early 2000s, by philosophers such as Jonathan Kvanvik, Dennis Whitcomb. Schmidt and Lahrudi have a brilliant article on the epistemic value of curiosity in educational sciences and philosophy of education. But there was very little, believe me, on the topic. Now things have progressed. In 2012, I published my book called The Philosophy of Curiosity. And after that, at least 4 more books, I think, have been published on the topic, and especially Perry Zern on the politics of curiosity, the social aspects of curiosity, and Nenad Miscevic just recently published a book on the epistemic value of curiosity, in which he argues that curiosity is an epistemic virtue. So it's very recent, and this is true even though at the very start of the beginning of philosophy, our founders, Plato and Aristotle, had this very famous statement saying all philosophy, philosophia, and by that they meant not just philosophy as we understand it today, but sciences as well. There was no clear distinction at the time, right? So all philosophy and science starts with wonder, as it has been translated into English. The Greek term they used was thaumazein. And for the lack of a better term, we say that's wonder, whatever that may mean, right? But it included other concepts such as awe, amazement, astonishment, perplexity, confusion. But these are all passive states, right? So when our founders said all science starts with thauma, they must have meant that it included, at least that ancient Greek concept of thaumazein must have included curiosity, because none of the other notions are names of motivators. They are passive states, but curiosity, most importantly, is the motivator that's I started it all, not just your field, my field as well. Philosophy and science started with curiosity. And despite the fact that they've said this, they didn't take the time to analyze what curiosity is, how in fact it appears, what are the conditions for it, what satisfies it, how does it relate to asking a question, how does it relate to becoming aware of your own ignorance, a topic that I'm going to be talking about today. The most of the literature in the medieval times on curiosity was on the dark side of curiosity, believe it or not. I mean, some of you, I'm sure, know about this, but for instance, St. Augustine said that curiosity is one of the three origins of human evil, human sin. And so it's very recent, but things are progressing. And I am not just a philosopher, I'm very much interested in the psychology literature. I'm trying to follow as much as I can the psychology and the neuroscience literature on the topic. We, in fact, edited a volume called The Moral Psychology of Curiosity just several years ago, which includes psychology, neuroscience, educational sciences, and of course, philosophy. And I'm fascinated to hear all these interesting things that you have to say on the topic. But I will be critical, okay? I mean, having said all that, I will be critical. For instance, it has been said in one of the sessions that it is not even debatable that infants are curious, but I think it is debatable. Saying that it is debatable doesn't imply that infants are not curious, but at least it brings up a question that I think we should address. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, here's a simple argument that infants cannot be curious. Curiosity requires awareness of ignorance. What do we mean by that? Curiosity requires becoming aware of something that you do not know. And becoming aware of something that you do not know is a form of what we call second-order knowledge. It requires a highly meta-level skill that I should call a meta-representational skill. It is knowing that you do not know. Only then you can be curious because you can single out a piece of knowledge that you are seeking. And if awareness of ignorance is a condition for knowledge, one might conclude that animals are not curious because they don't have that skill. One might conclude that at very early developmental times of children, infants, maybe early infants, do not have that skill yet. So that brings us to the psychology literature, because this dilemma has been debated by Levenstein and Berline. So let me go to that text where Berline famously this is the first important work of Berline. Maybe it's not the first, but it's certainly the most influential, in which a theory of human curiosity, published in the early 50s, in which he makes the famous distinction between perceptual curiosity and epistemic curiosity, which relates to our topic, of course, because perceptual curiosity is the more primitive of the two. It is the type of curiosity we share with other animals. It exhibits itself in exploratory behavior, whereas epistemic curiosity, says Berline, is the type of curiosity that is more advanced, that only human beings have, and is not shared with other animals. Now, he doesn't give a strict definition of epistemic curiosity, but once we read it, we understand that in order to enjoy epistemic curiosity, one has to have the skill to ask a question or be asked a question. Epistemic curiosity can be internally motivated, stimulated, or externally stimulated as well, either depending on whether you're the author of the question or whether someone is asking you a question. But in any case, it requires language. It requires language. It requires you to grasp a certain interrogative sentence as asking a question whose answer you do not know. So I take it, even though he doesn't explicitly say so, I take it that, according to Berline, epistemic curiosity is the type of curiosity that can be enjoyed by those beings who do have the capacity to become aware of their own ignorance. Because if you don't know the answer, if you're not aware that you don't know the answer to the question, then the question cannot arouse your curiosity. So what he called perceptual curiosity is, I think, what you are more interested in once you're concentrating on infants, pre-language children, okay? And perceptual curiosity he defined as the kind of curiosity which is aroused by external stimuli. It's always externally stimulated, and it is continued as you are more and more exposed to that stimuli. And once as you know, the examples you have given, once the child becomes more familiar with the entity in question, then the curiosity drive is satisfied. Now, is perceptual curiosity really curiosity, or is it proto-curiosity, or is it simply exploratory behavior that is caused by a more primitive drive? There are many candidates, of course. Boredom drive, as Fowler said, for example. Fowler was in the 50s a behaviorist who almost associated curiosity with the boredom drive. Other terms have been introduced, as you know, novelty seeking, sensation seeking, conflict resolution. But none of this requires the being to become aware of their own ignorance, it looks like. Or if it does, it needs to be shown, right? So when you give the child an object that the child is unfamiliar with, and the child takes that object in her hand and explores it, is the child aware that that's an unfamiliar object and there's something unknown about it? That's a question. I don't know the answer to that question. Why? Because the child cannot speak, and we cannot ask the child whether this is what is going on or not. And the only evidence we have in order for us to attribute curiosity to the child is a certain kind of exploratory behavior. And it may very well be the case that we're imposing some kind of anthropomorphism, correct? Usually anthropomorphism is used to, is used to criticize, attributing properties to non-human animals or even objects. But here I call this adult anthropomorphism. The language we use to describe the behavior of children and animals and other beings is based on the adult language that we use, that we already have the capacity to ask questions and to express our curiosity. So if there's some other way of explaining the behavior of the child or the animal, for that matter, that would, for instance, be caused by some other drive that is more primitive, then this may not be curiosity. It may be called proto-curiosity. But I'm not going to take any side on this, but I'm not the only one who has made this point, by the way. Levenstein, I found, and is perhaps the most cited article in the literature, in the psychology literature. Levenstein's text does make this point. He goes through not just the distinction between epistemic and perceptual curiosity, but Berline's other distinction between diversive and specific curiosity. In fact, let me also point out that initially when Berline made this distinction, he did not use the notion of curiosity. It was a distinction between two types of behavior, specific and diversive exploratory behavior. So it was a distinction between two types of exploratory behavior. And then it was from that we extracted a distinction between two types of curiosity. So we got a fourfold distinction: the distinction between specific and diversive, and this distinction between perceptual and epistemic. And here we see Levenstein being quite skeptical of this. And just read like this sentence is sufficient to see how critical he is. However, by including diversive and perceptual curiosity, those are the two categories that Levenstein is quite skeptical of, correct? In his fourfold distinction, Berline effectively institutionalized the tendency to classify the desire for change and novelty as curiosity. There are other candidates. It may not just be a novelty-seeking behavior. It may not just be a desire for or drive for change. There are other candidates that we may not even be aware of, that the very primitive drives that may be causing these kinds of behavior. So Levenstein says he'll be concentrating only on specific epistemic curiosity in this, and his information gap theory that follows this is a theory of specific epistemic curiosity. And my interpretation is he thinks that's the only kind of curiosity there is. I am inclined in this direction myself, believe me. But even if we suppose that infants or diversive perceptual exploratory behavior is not curiosity, it is definitely something that relates to curiosity and might be a prerequisite for that being to become curious. What is important is that the child, after a certain point, starts asking questions, start understanding questions, and start seeking knowledge and representing this absence of knowledge in their minds. And that's an important leap, right? Because diversive perceptual curiosity, if it exists in animals, exists in infants, but that is not sufficient for them, for instance, to do science. That is not sufficient for them to do philosophy. So then we have two options. We're either going to say this is proto-curiosity, not genuine curiosity yet, or we're going to distinguish between two types of curiosity. And that brings me to my hypothesis. Either way, I don't really mind whether we call it curiosity or not. That may, at the end of the day, be a terminological choice. But what is important is that there's a very important leap, and I call this the leap hypothesis. A leap from a very primitive stage to a more advanced stage. And once there's this leap, then the being becomes aware of their own ignorance and starts asking questions. This requires not just language, but it requires more than that. That's my hypothesis, the leap hypothesis, I call it. And this is not the leap hypothesis, a hypothesis that I've developed from my theory of curiosity, but it is not just a hypothesis about child development, but it is also a hypothesis concerning the evolution of language and human evolution. So what is this hypothesis? So let me have a few things to say about that. Now, in order to understand that hypothesis, I need to go back to what awareness of ignorance is, because that's the key notion. And Levenstein definitely agrees with me. If you read between the lines, he never explicitly says so, but his information gap theory is based on the idea that there is some information that you seek that you represent in your mind as information that you lack. And therefore, in order for you to seek a piece of information that you lack, you need to be aware of it. And that's exactly what I call awareness of ignorance. Of course, he puts it in terms of information, and then he changes to knowledge and almost uses the two terms interchangeably. And I think many neuroscientists today and psychologists use those two terms interchangeably. But from a philosophical point of view, that distinction is extremely important. Not every piece of information is knowledge, for the simple reason that if you agree that information may be false, then when we're curious, we're not just seeking information, we're seeking true information. And we're not just seeking true information, we're seeking true information that is based on good evidence, what philosophers like to call justified information. And justified true belief has been the classical definition of knowledge. So when we're seeking, when we're curious, we're not just seeking information, we're seeking accurate information that is true of reality with good evidence. And therefore, what we're really seeking is knowledge, one might say. Right? So the using information and knowledge interchangeably is a problem for Levenstein's theory, I believe, but that's a side issue. Now let's come to awareness of ignorance. So I just recently, so after I published my book, I realized that this notion has to be analyzed further. I had touched upon it in the book. So I published this article quite recently called Awareness of Ignorance. It's open access, you can find it easily. And I'm raising the question, what kinds of skills does a being need to have in order to become aware of its own ignorance? That's the question I'm dealing with. And that requires language. Now, without language, can a being become aware of their own ignorance? Maybe so, only if you can have non-conceptual, non-linguistic representations that allows this being, for instance, an animal, to represent something as being unknown in their minds. which is I'm very highly skeptical about this, but it is possible. So I'm concentrating on human beings, those beings like us who speak a language and who can express their lack of knowledge, their ignorance, by using language. For that, we need to go into the notion of representation and the different linguistic semantic theories out there. So there are two very important, so I need to understand, we need to understand how it is that a being, in order to become curious, represents in their mind something as being unknown to them. That's the main question. Only then can they become aware of their ignorance. And to do that, they need to be able to use language in a very peculiar way. Because language normally, typically, makes use of concepts that are tools of representation of familiar entities. So how is it that by using language, we can represent things that we're unfamiliar with, some things that we are ignorant of, that things that are unknown to us? That's the question. So I go into the two major theories, semantic theories. One is Frege, and I extract a neo-Fregean account. I'm going to skip these parts. And then the second most influential theory, Bertrand Russell's theory, semantic theory, theory of descriptions. And I discuss how it can be accounted for in Russell's theory. Neither of them have talked about awareness of ignorance and curiosity, but then I give a unified account. This is the important part where I talk about mental representations. So here's the basic idea. By using language, by using concepts, we mentally represent entities that we have experienced, that we have some degree of acquaintance with, some degree of familiarity with. We then bring these concepts together by using what Chomsky calls the merge function, right? We put the concepts together and we form a complex concept. And that complex concept now allows us to represent something unknown to us. And that requires self-reflection, because now you have a concept and you need to be able to do some kind of epistemic self-reflection and become aware that that concept represents something unknown to you. Okay, and that requires representing the concept as representing something unknown. And that's why it is an instance, a very important instance of meta-representational skill. So awareness of ignorance has three important components. One of them is that it's an intentional state. That is, it has conceptual content. The other one is that it's an intentional state with the T, that it is what Berline called specific curiosity. And I say curiosity is always specific. It is an intentional mental state in the sense that it is always about an unknown. The diversive exploratory behavior, you can always account for that in terms of a boredom drive. Right? But curiosity is aimed at, directed to, about, of something unknown. And if you agree with that, then this makes awareness of ignorance that is required by curiosity an intentional state that is directed towards something you're ignorant of. And that requires meta-representation, as I call it. It's a meta-representational state since it requires the agent to represent a representation as determining an unknown entity. I know this is all very, abstract and technical. I don't know how much of it you're able to follow, but I'll give you a few examples, okay? So that maybe it will make a bit more sense. Suppose you have the concept of sky, and you have the concept of blue. Now, sky is a concept that you use to represent something that you are to some degree familiar with. That's how we use concepts typically, correct? We have concept of trees, concept of mountains, concepts of planets. So you have this concept of sky, you have the concept of blue, which allows you to represent entities with that color, which you are familiar with, correct? So blueness and skyness are things that you're familiar with. You also have the concept of cause, and that is something you're familiar with because you have experienced many cause and effect relationships in your life. So the concept of cause is also something you're familiar with. So now you have three concepts, sky, blue, and cause. Now you bring these three concepts together, you merge them. Of course, you have to use syntax. That's where syntax comes into play. You have to put those in a certain kind of order so that you will get a complex concept now, the cause of skies being blue on Earth, if you like, okay? Because the sky is not blue on other planets, as we know, right? The sky, if you like, at Earth, you have the concept of Earth, a representation of Earth. So then that is how you can, in fact, raise the question, why is the sky blue on Earth? And if you don't know the answer to that question, then you have asked a question out of curiosity. So you have put three concepts whose extensions, objects that you're familiar with, in a certain order to describe something that is unknown to you, namely the cause of the skies being blue. And that is a complex concept. And I call that an inostensible concept, which is the basis of my theory of curiosity. Curiosity requires inostensible conceptualization. That is, conceptualization of an unknown. Suppose you have the concept of sun, planet, moon, most. Put them together, you get the planet of the sun, which has the most number of moons. And if you don't know the answer, maybe it's Saturn, maybe it's Jupiter, you don't know the answer, you put all those concepts together, and those concepts represent things that you are more or less familiar with to some degree. There's always a degree of ignorance whenever there's knowledge, okay? To some degree, but that's not making you curious, right? You're not curious about what a planet is. You can be, but not in this case. You put those things together and then you describe an unknown. You're in fact referring to an unknown planet, the planet in the solar system, which has the most number of moons. And if you don't know which planet that is, then your mind is directed to, is representing an object which is unknown to you. That's inostensible reference. And that's the basis of at least this advanced form of curiosity. And so you raise the question, which planets of the sun has the most number of moons? You have a representation of John Lennon. You have a representation of murder. And then you put them together, the person, and the concept of person, the person who murdered John Lennon. You can raise this question. You have put three concepts together, and if you don't know the murderer, then you're raising a question out of curiosity. And that requires to form the representation, but then come to realize that that representation represents an unknown entity to you. So you're attributing a property to your own representation, an epistemic property, and that requires you to not just have the representation, but have a representation of the representation, and that's what makes it meta-representational. Now, let's give an example of a case that goes back to early childhood. Suppose you give a child a fruit, let's say a fruit that looks like an apple, and suppose the child already has acquired the concept of an apple, but this is a yellow apple, and the child has seen yellow apples, but is not exactly sure whether this is an apple. It could be a quince. They look very similar, correct? So in that case, the child has two representations. One is a singular representation of the fruit that she sees. The other one is the more general representation of apple in general, okay? And puts them together, this being an apple, is this an apple? That's how you, in fact, ask the question, is this an apple? Now that question requires the child to put those concepts together to form a complete proposition. These are cases of propositional curiosity, and to seek whether they are true or false. So the child is then curious whether the proposition that this is an apple is true or false. Once again, you have a representation of this fruit being an apple possibly, and would like to know whether that representation corresponds to reality. And that relates to truth. Most likely, if the child does not have the concept of truth, the child cannot ask that question. And one other thing I'd like to say is that it is not sufficient for a child to utter interrogative sentences. The child could rather, easily say, what is this? Does that indicate that the child is expressing curiosity that is based on awareness of ignorance and a meta-representation of an unknown? Maybe not. Maybe the child is just repeating the interrogative form to draw attention from her parents, for instance. So and this has been noted by Levenstein, by many others, not every act of asking a question, not even every act of information seeking is curiosity, right? In order for there to be curiosity, you need an interest in the topic, you need to attend, the mind has to be directed towards an unknown, and that unknown has to be specified, right? So it is important to note that asking a question out of curiosity is the important thing. So I'm sometimes also skeptical about these trivia questions, for instance, being used in tests by psychologists, and some of you, I'm sure you do it too, and it was mentioned in earlier talks, because those trivia questions draw the attention of the subjects. There's no doubt about that. They try to answer, but their motivation may not be curiosity. Asking an interrogative question or trying to answer an interrogative question is not asking a question or out of curiosity necessarily, I think. So let me share with you. I think I have some more time, correct? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Why can't I make it bigger? Okay, I'd like to share with you a famous quote, and if I can find it if you give me a second. There it is, okay. So John Archibald Wheeler famously said, some of you I'm sure know about this, "We live on an island surrounded by a sea of ignorance. As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance." A beautiful statement. So the island represents our knowledge, and as the island grows, the shores of ignorance grow as well. Now, I love this quote, and I use it in my classes and everything, but I have to make a little correction. It's very important to make this little correction. We have to add one word here, because it is inconsistent to say, as our knowledge grows, we become more ignorant. That is inconsistent. It's simply there's a contradiction there, right? Because you know more than you used to, so you can't be more ignorant. What increases is not your ignorance, it's your awareness of ignorance. This is very important. For instance, in the early days, like Plato was ignorant about the Higgs boson. Plato was, I mean, as being the most intelligent and most influential philosopher of all times, Plato was ignorant about the mass of the world. Plato was ignorant about gravity, correct? There were many things that Plato was ignorant of, but he could not have become aware of his ignorance because he did not have the concepts, those concepts. He did not have the concept of the Higgs boson. He did not have the concept of mass. He did not have the concept of gravity. So it's one thing to be ignorant, it's another thing to become aware that you're ignorant, okay? So when the island grows, it is not our ignorance that grows, it is the awareness of ignorance. So we have to add one word. And awareness of ignorance in that sense is extremely important. Without awareness of ignorance, there's no science, there's no philosophy, and there's no curiosity, at least in this advanced form, okay? So that's one thing I wanted to share with you. And the other one is, after the publication of my book on curiosity, I've done a lot of research on curiosity. And one of the problems that I had to face, what sounds like a very simple problem, and you might say, what exactly is the problem? I was doing a taxonomy of questions as I was writing my book, because if curiosity, at least epistemic curiosity in Berlein's term, is that kind of curiosity that is expressed by the utterance of an interrogative sentence, then by doing a taxonomy of different kinds of questions, we can, in fact, from that deduce a different kind of taxonomy of curiosity, right? Are there different types of questions? Yes. And therefore, for each corresponding type of question, there must be a type of curiosity. For instance, Aristotle famously distinguished between whether questions and what questions. Like, what is love, you might ask, or you might ask, is there water on Mars? So in one case, you're curious about whether there's water on Mars. In the other case, you're asking for the nature of love. Those are very different kinds of curiosity. One of them I call objectual, because it is directed towards a certain object. For instance, when you ask a who question, your mind is directed towards an unknown person. You represent an unknown person in your mind. When you ask a where question, you represent an unknown location in your mind. When you ask a why question, you represent either an unknown cause or an unknown reason, assuming they're not the same, in your mind, and so on and so forth, with how, a procedure, a method, and so on. But when you ask a whether question, it becomes very difficult. These are questions that can simply be answered by yes or no. And they're supposed to be the easiest types of questions. But my theory said, if one is curious, they're curious about something. Curiosity is intentional, always specific in Berline's terms, directed towards an unknown. So what is the thing that we're curious about when we ask a whether question, or when we ask simply a yes/no question? And that turned out to be the most difficult case, in fact, because that requires understanding what truth is. Because when you're asking the question whether there's liquid water on Mars, a yes/no question, you would like to know whether it is true or it is false that there's water on Mars. You're singling out a certain claim, there's water on Mars, and you would like to know which of those properties it has. But that's a very sophisticated property. There are so many different theories of truth. So one thing led to another. And finally, I ended up with a theory of truth. I developed a theory of truth based on my curiosity research, trying to answer this question, just trying to analyze what it means to say yes and what it means to say no. Remember, these are important words. Why? Because we haven't talked too much about that, but there's the other side of the coin concerning satisfaction of curiosity. Okay, what satisfies our curiosity? That's a hot topic in philosophy. I didn't have time to go into it. Does knowledge satisfy curiosity? Always. I'm inclined to think it doesn't, because knowledge comes in degrees, on my view. Levenstein also thinks that knowledge doesn't always satisfy curiosity. So those are interesting questions, but it's very, very, very peculiar that you ask a very important question and a simple yes or a simple no sometimes satisfies your curiosity. How does it achieve that? How do those mystical words do that? So I had to analyze it. And that led to a certain theory of truth, which will be published soon. And I'd like to draw your attention to the, if I can find it, the last chapter of that book, which is on that leap theory. Okay, so this is the book that is coming out by Routledge very soon. And in this book, I talk about the referential theory. In fact, in the introduction, I talk a lot about curiosity. In the preface, or the prologue, as I call it, I go back to my earlier research on curiosity, how the theory of curiosity, in fact, inspired me to come up with this theory. So curiosity turns out to be an incredibly rich topic, okay, that connects to so many different things. And it has implications with respect to psychology and evolution and neuroscience. And that's, and at the end, I talk about the applications and implications of this new theory. And this last part, and in the epilogue, okay, I concentrate on the leap theory in the following way concerning human evolution. But it also applies to child development, which I mentioned. But I single out evolution, which is my major concern, because I want to work on that. This is the idea that there are, in fact, there's a primitive language that we use to talk about things in reality. This language is made up of sentences that are about physical entities. And I even invented a new verb, to subjectify. They subjectify things. They make things the subject matter of judgments. That's what I mean by subjectification. But then there is another kind of language that we use daily, which I call the conceptual language. And the conceptual language doesn't use concepts to represent things in reality, but uses concepts to talk about concepts, right? It subjectifies concepts. The very typical example is when you, for example, make a negative existential claim. When you say there are no unicorns. If there are no unicorns, aren't you contradicting yourself? There are no unicorns. So how can you be referring to unicorns and then saying that they don't exist? No, you are referring to the concept. You're subjectifying the concept of unicorn. And you're saying of that concept, it has a certain property. Nothing in reality corresponds to it. What we call empty concept, right? So you're attributing a property to a concept, not a thing. And that's how we have typically a conceptual language. We use conceptual language in everyday life as adults so much, so frequently, that we kind of do not notice how we switch from the thing language to the concept language. Of course, the child, now, in the evolutionary process of language, there is this transition. So my hypothesis is that there was a transition from a primitive thing language to a more sophisticated concept language, and that is what enabled us to develop sciences. Without it, sciences could not have been possible. Why? Because I tried to show that the conceptual language includes sentences that allow us to use the concepts of truth and falsity, first of all. They are a part of meta language. Okay? And that should remind you of the false belief task that, you know, children fail, correct? Children fail, even though they have a language, they fail the false belief task. Now, some interpret that to imply that they have not developed a theory of mind yet, which is presumably correct. But it may also be the case that they cannot distinguish between truth and falsity. Because distinguishing between what is true and what is false requires subjectifying a whole proposition, which is nothing but a complex concept, on my view. So there's that. Without a conceptual language, we cannot distinguish between what exists and what does not exist. That requires conceptual language. And that's very important, correct, for doing science. We cannot distinguish between what is actual and what is possible. Not only we cannot have science, we cannot have literature, we cannot have arts without that distinction. Because what is possible is not a representation of reality. It's our conceptual, you know, construction only. So, but most importantly, we cannot ask questions in a simple thing language. Because asking a question out of curiosity, even the development of interrogative sentences in the emergence of language required our ancestors to develop this meta-representational skill so that they can form a concept and represent that concept as representing something unknown to them. That meta-representational skill is what led to the emergence of interrogative sentences. Okay, this is a hypothesis. There are many ways in which you can argue against this hypothesis, but if the hypothesis is correct, then first language emerged in the evolutionary process, and then there came a point where we had a kind of a leap from the thing language to the concept language. And after that, we were able to develop the concepts of truth and falsity, existence, non-existence. Okay. And most importantly, that's when interrogative sentences emerged in language as tools by which we ask questions out of curiosity. Now, if this hypothesis is correct for the evolution of language, so if it's correct, you know, phylogenetically, it may also be correct ontogenetically in the development of child. In fact, those psychologists and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists who work on especially theory of mind, when does the child develop a theory of mind, in fact, are very accustomed to this idea that there is a certain leap, even, and this is after the acquisition of language, correct? First, there's the acquisition of language, and after like maybe 30 months old or whatever, I don't do 2.5 years old or something like that, they start gradually passing the false belief task, which shows that there's a certain kind of leap there. And that leap may, in fact, be related to what I'm talking about. That leap may, in fact, allow them to have a transition from a thing language to a conceptual language. So all in all, let me just finish by saying that we have two choices. We could either say that early childhood, infancy, children are not curious, but what we may call it proto-curiosity, or we may call it genuine curiosity, perceptual curiosity, diversive curiosity, if you like. But either way, there's this more sophisticated form of curiosity that emerges later in the development of the child, which requires, on my view, a meta-representational skill. Thank you all for your patience.